Have you ever felt like your identity is wrapped up in health, wellness, and control? Are you so obsessed with dieting, health, and fitness that you can no longer live flexibly or in the moment? Are you missing out socially because of your strict food rules and fitness routines? Well, you are absolutely not alone. Welcome back to another episode of Full and Thriving, the podcast that helps you reclaim your life, heal your relationship with food, and embrace authentic living. I'm your host, Meg McCabe, a certified recovery coach, community founder, retreat leader, and speaker who has spent the last decade helping other people reach mental healing and build a better life for themselves. Today, we're diving into a topic that many struggle with: breaking free from wellness obsession. Our guest, Mallory Paige, a registered dietitian, opens up about her personal journey through the highs and lows of wellness obsession, which ultimately led her to a mental health breakdown. But that breakdown, it was a catalyst for a profound shift in how she viewed health and well-being. In this episode, we'll explore how Mallory broke the chains of rigid wellness rules, embraced flexibility, and learned to trust her intuition, both around food and life. So, if you're ready to challenge your wellness identity and break free from restrictive health norms, stick around. Let's dive into this transformative conversation. Hi, Mallory. How are you doing today?
I'm good. I'm so excited to be here.
Welcome to the show. I'm so excited to have you. I think we have a really exciting topic planned. But before we dive into that, I really would love for you to share with the audience a bit about your professional background.
Yeah, so I am a registered dietitian, and it's been close to 5 years now, which feels really weird to say how fast time goes, as we all know. But I essentially went into becoming a registered dietitian from the story of what we're going to talk about today. So it really ties in well, but I've focused in my profession on helping women, just similar to you, with their relationship to food, their body, movement, all of those good things, and just getting in tune with how to really eat in a way that helps them feel their best.
I love that. Yes, I'm really curious about how you actually arrived to this point. So would you mind sharing also like a bit about your start in this world? Like, you mentioned to me that you had a wellness obsession when you were younger, and I want to kind of dive into the root of that, how that started for you.
It's so interesting because I grew up in Colorado, in an area close to Boulder, Colorado, which, if you guys are familiar with that, is very wellness oriented. So a lot of people thought that that's where it started for me. Even my parents thought, oh my gosh, well, is this our fault? Because I always say, no, it really didn't start there, which I think is kind of interesting. It actually started when I was in sports. I was someone that was extremely competitive, and I was working with this trainer, and he said, why don't you write down what you're eating so that we can become more aware of it? And it wasn't even something that was really extreme, how he said it, but I have the type of personality. Well, I don't like to define myself this way anymore. I like to feel as if I've progressed through this and am now just working on continuing to cultivate this. But I was someone that always went to extreme. So you give me an inch and I'm taking it a mile. So once I wrote down my food, it was just this obsession point of how can I make this as healthy as possible, and trying to optimize in every single way, not only just for the sport, but also in general. And so that was how things really kicked off. And there's so much that unfolded from there. But I do think that that starting point, amongst a number of other things that were going on in my life, is what really led to the wellness obsession.
Wow. So just one slightly innocent comment from a doctor who wanted you to like optimize your performance in sports, it sounds like.
Yeah, it was this personal trainer that I was working with at the time that said it. And again, it wasn't something that was so intense, but I think that when you have the right environment where I was feeling stressed and already out of control, and, I was dealing with a lot of things in my life, and I always say that those things often proceed when we then use food as our control mechanism, right? Or the thing that we use to bring us joy or whatever else you may want to throw in there.
Yeah. So was anything else going on in your life at the time that made you feel like this was the right thing to do to control your food?
When I look back and reflect on it, I do feel like I was just struggling to know who I was. And I think so many of us relate to that. But in high school, I felt like I had a little bit of a hard time finding my place, which is when this was. So I also just feel like it was in this time where I was kind of trying to decide, am I going to be able to go to school for sports? And I was looking at all of these things, and there was just a lot of things over time that were compiling, and I wasn't dealing with my emotions. I wasn't coping in an effective way. And so then when this came along, I always say that it felt like I had made a new best friend, but that best friend was completely in my control. It was my phone. I was like, perfect. I can just look to this and it will bring me everything I want.
Oh my gosh. So you were getting a sense of control out of that.
Mm-hmm.
And what else were you getting out of that, like hyper focus on your food?
It became a big identity for me. It's so funny. I actually wrote one of my college essays even about this and how I would bring food everywhere, right? Because I would go out to eat with people, but I would only eat the food that I would bring. I wouldn't eat the food that other people would bring, or I would always have snacks. And I knew I was going to school to become a dietitian. And so it just really started to give me this identity. And also my coaches and trainers, they were all validating me for it, telling me I was doing a good job, putting me on even a pedestal over the other players or athletes, which is a horrible thing to do. But they thought they were being kind and helpful. And so that identity felt so comforting in that moment. And I also think that when you don't feel like you fully fit in, if you can almost have something you can cling to that allows for you to stand out in a weird way, that made me feel better. Just almost as if, I'm different because of this, but this thing is quote unquote good, not bad.
Wow. So there's so much like culminating at once to put you into this spot that makes you really obsessed with wellness. And, one question I have, was weight loss a part of this for you, or was it mostly this health identity that motivated this?
It's such a good question. And I'm glad that you ask it, because so many of the people that come to me, I don't know if you deal with this either, but a lot of people deal with weight loss or the desire to change their body. But I also think there's so many of us that maybe don't have that at the forefront. And for me, it honestly wasn't at the forefront of my mind at the time when it started. It was really about the food. Don't get me wrong. I had struggles with my body image even a little bit before this all started, but I was more focused on the health aspect of it than anything. And it didn't really escalate to a focus on my body until I was no longer an athlete, when I was no longer in school. And I think that there was an element of, I was more focused on performance than I was how I looked. But then once I didn't have to focus on performance, then I leaned into, okay, now how can I change the way I look? Because I didn't have that athlete identity anymore. So
I think you're right in the case of, there are so many people where the pursuit of weight loss or changing their body is not the root of it, or like even part of it really. It's deeper in a sense that it's about that control or that identity. Insert any unmet need here, right? And so I think so many people are going to be relating to that because it's expressed to me all the time in my practice.
Yeah.
So, okay. Wow. So you had this, how would you say your definition of health, like what's it first of all, what was your definition of health back then? Let's start there.
It's so funny to me because this is a question that I ask people a lot is not only what is your definition of health, but then what is your goal of being healthy? And so when I think back to my definition of health, then it was a lot of ingredient obsession and just slowly but surely taking more and more and more away. And I feel like there's a ton of this right now. It's kind of the whole idea of, yes, it's not good to restrict your food, but you should be focusing on everything that's in your food. That was kind of my mindset, which I thought was good because it wasn't taking the amount of food away or the amount that you're eating. So I would say that without going into a ton of specifics, it was a lot of the traditional wellness stuff that you would imagine. Ingredients you shouldn't eat, things that we see sensationalized in the media. And then me also just wanting to put my own spin on how I can optimize those things to the ultimate level for what I was doing.
I find that to be so interesting how everyone's like disordered relationship with food or eating disorder can really manifest differently. And so yours was a lot of that orthorexia mindset of like finding the right ingredients, the purity of the foods, all of that. My next question for you really is, at what point did you realize that this obsession wasn't healthy for you? Did you have a specific low point that you can recall where things started to shift?
When I started, and some of the story that I've relayed now, my wellness obsession was able to somewhat be swept under the rug. There were some people that noticed it, but it wasn't something that a lot of people thought was bad. Then when I went to college, I escalated in starting to track everything and over exercising even more. And so there was some interesting ways that started to bring up a few questions for certain people, right? Because it was impeding upon my life even more. But honestly, most of the time, there were not a lot of outside sources that were telling me that what I was doing was concerning. And so the low point actually had to come from my own self. And I would love to. I always say that people will ask me about my journey and like, when did I know? I'm like, do not follow what I did because I took it to the worst extreme that you could. I basically had a mental breakdown. I mean, that was essentially what it was. It was from a bunch of other things in my life. I had too many stresses. I was trying too hard to be perfect. I couldn't maintain food in the same way. I started having what I thought were extremely concerning things like binging. I was also in college, so it's like using drinking in a way that wasn't supportive. And it got to a point where it was so bad and these things that were happening in my life were affecting me so much that I essentially had to look at it and say, I can't keep doing this anymore. And I would love to say it was a very simple journey on an upward trajectory from there. It wasn't, but that was the first time where I realized I have to stop doing what I'm doing with food and exercise.
Wow. Okay. So tell me more about this mental breakdown. Like, did you have any moments where you're like, I am not well, like this is not okay?
Yeah, it's always an interesting thing because whenever I talk about my journey, I always am mindful of how this mental health journey and this eating disorder, I never got diagnosed with an eating disorder. So you could really call it whatever you want, right? But how these two things intertwined. And yet, whenever I talk about it, I almost don't want it to be something that feels like it's so extreme and people are like, oh my gosh, does mine have to get that extreme, But to actually answer the question, what I've now understood from looking back is that my nervous system was completely shot. I was so overly stressed. I hadn't dealt with a lot of these traumas that I had had. And then I had another traumatic experience right before this that like stirred all of them up again. And so I was just suppressing and suppressing and suppressing, trying still to use food and exercise as my way of coping, but they couldn't handle everything I was dealing with anymore, you know? And so the way that it manifested for me is very unique. So most people probably have not experienced it, but it was basically what looked like they thought that what I was having were seizures, but I was not having seizures. They're basically called non-epileptic seizures. And it's something that people that often have experienced trauma, they'll deal with. And so I would be having those for so many hours in a day at school or like totally messed up where it's like, well, yeah, you have to do something about it at that point. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It's like a burning red flag.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying. Don't do what I did.
I think it's a good example of how like people can run themselves to the ground and tolerate it and tolerate it and tolerate it. And then something wakes them up out of it if they're lucky.
Yeah, exactly. I do feel really lucky because it felt like my body screaming at me, hey, you have to do this. And I mean, that is a gift, even though it, at the time didn't feel like that.
Yeah. And did you connect all of those issues that you were having with this wellness obsession? Like, what was your heart telling you? What was your intuition telling you about the root of this problem?
At the time, I would say no, because I continued to really grapple with what my relationship with food and exercise and my body was meant to look like. And it was so hard for me to let go of some of those pieces and to understand that they were even contributing. But now looking back, it's so clear that there were all these things that were extremely interconnected that were affecting each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So you didn't really see that was part of the picture. How did you get on your journey of healing then, if that wasn't so obvious in that moment?
It was kind of a stumbling through, to be honest. That's a
nice way of putting it, actually.
At first, I was dealing with the mental health stuff. So I was targeting all the mental health things that I was dealing with.
Okay.
Because even at the time when I went, I had to get a bunch of like evaluations and different things for what I was mentioning was happening. And they couldn't quite figure it out at the time. It was only after the fact that they figured out what was actually going on. And so at that time, they were just saying, oh, you must be really stressed. So I was trying to deal with the stress. But then as I started to deal with the stress and started to do practices to work with that, then I started to recognize, oh, now that my mind is even slightly clearer from this survival mode stress, I'm recognizing I'm spending a lot of time stressed about food and my body.
Oh.
And also, I was so upset about the binging that I was doing because I wasn't a binge eater before. And then when this all started to happen, that was a piece that came up. So I think those two things started to make me address it in the first place. So I'll start with that because we could go on and on, but I'm trying to be mindful of not just talking your ear off.
Oh no, I'm totally okay with it. I'm here to learn about your journey. So I think that's really helpful. I find that so interesting how once you started to get out of survival mode, you were able to see clearly there was a bit of a wellness obsession and it was stressing you out. What steps did you take from there? I know it was a stumbling. Looking back at the story in your eyes, how did you start to break free from that?
It was a lot of the traditional stuff that you would imagine with someone that is more obsessed with wellness or feels like they tend towards orthorexia. It's breaking the rules that you have sometimes I think rules makes us other ourselves. Oh, I don't have rules. So you can even just say preferences, right? Or things that you're typically in as patterns. And so it was, okay, I don't feel like I should eat this food, so I'm going to, or I feel like I should only eat at this time, so I'm going to break that. So it was a lot of that, expanding what I was eating, expanding how I was eating. And that was really emotional and challenging, but it was also possible as I was able to do it and, talk with a therapist and all that stuff and work through it. But then it was also simultaneously addressing all the other things that we've talked about. Why am I using this as a tool for control? How can I cope in different ways? Because if you don't, for me, at least personally, if I hadn't paired them, then it would have been really hard because I would have been removing my only coping mechanism and also not having any to replace it with. So that was a big part of the journey as well.
Finding those coping mechanisms. What were your coping mechanisms, or do you have any that you suggest to your clients right now that can be really helpful?
They've definitely evolved over time. Honestly, even though it sounds kind of silly, one of the biggest ones was even just being able to sit. And I know that doesn't sound like coping, right? I guess that's something that feels like it's creating space, but I went around my day never having 1 ounce of time with my own brain. I had to just go, 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 go. So some people don't resonate with the idea of meditation, and I really didn't when I started. And so I'm like, what if you just drove in the car and you didn't have music on? Like, what if you just were able to sit or do something? So that was big for me. Plus doing other things that felt movement adjacent because I was still very body oriented. So could I stretch? Could I do like a more chill type of yoga class? Could I, read, or even that's not as body oriented, but can I do a coloring book? There's so many things like that I feel like I suggest, and they've evolved over time into now having more complex things. But oftentimes when I'm talking with my clients who are first trying to implement this, I just ask them, like, what brings you joy? Like, what things make you happy?
Yeah.
And how can we implement those as well?
Mm-hmm. I think you bring up a really good point here. Just like recognizing you do want to have maybe a professional available to guide you through this exploration process of like what brings you joy, what kind of coping mechanisms, like healthier coping mechanisms, can you replace this rigidity of the wellness obsession, orthorexia, whatever, have it, so that you can actually like live without that. But that's always like a challenge for people. I find that, it's essentially like an exposure that brings up all the emotions and all of the things. Did you find a lot of those emotional things were coming up while you were working through this?
Oh yeah, that was definitely the biggest piece, especially when you have, this isn't to say there's levels of it, but for me, something that came up was just having to deal with the trauma, because it was the emotions, but then it was also the trauma as well, which I think what I always say is if you have trauma, I do feel like it's very helpful to have someone guiding you through that too,
Mm-hmm.
So it was both of those things for me. Something as simple as the emotion of, oh, I'm sad or I'm angry that I went through this, that can feel simple, but just feeling that when I didn't feel my emotions before, I just suppressed them. Or something as big as, oh crap, I see how this thing affected my life and how I view myself so much, and then facing that piece. So yeah.
What advice do you have for people who are afraid to feel their emotions?
That was so me. I was so many years, and I'm thinking back to that past version of myself and the way that what she would have needed to actually hear that would resonate. And I feel like the biggest thing would be that you're going to feel them at some point. It can't keep going like this forever. And so you're choosing whether to feel them in a titrated way, or if you're going to allow it to be a dam that bursts. And that's what I chose, was the dam that bursts. But I think that now I see, even though it's uncomfortable, maybe in a moment to feel something, it passes quickly. I love this analogy that one of my mentors uses around this, that does a lot of nervous system work. And she says, imagine when you see a kid fall or get sad or whatever it is, and how long it takes them from that point in time to when they recover, right? They fall on the ground, they cry for 90 seconds, and then they're distracted by something else a lot of the time. But if you see when it builds up and builds up and builds up and builds up, right? And then they have this tantrum. That's often what you're doing when you're suppressing. So just allow yourself to feel it, and it makes it go through so much more quickly.
Yes. I always like to think of like short-term gratification versus long-term gratification in this sense. So with choosing to avoid your emotion, it's the short-term gratification. It's like the easy way out. You're like, I'm just going to push this aside and feel great right now and just continue on feeling great and feeling nothing essentially, but I'm going to push through. It's all going to be fine. But what that does is that it sets you up for that like dam that bursts open later, where the long-term gratification or having that long-term sense of reward is, if I deal and cope with this emotion as it simmers to the surface, or as it trickles through the dam, I'm going to feel a lot better in the long run. It's just going to feel uncomfortable now. So you have to choose that discomfort in the moment.
Yes, that's so perfectly said.
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, thank you. And second of all, I mean, I love that analogy you just shared with like the floodgates opening, the dam bursting open versus just like keeping those emotions, feeling them. I actually feel really proud of myself now when I feel my emotions appropriately and let them kind of like transform that energy and let it out of my body. So yeah. But I know another piece of your work is this piece about intuition. So what I love about your story is it goes from being this like rigid, wellness obsessed individual whose identity is health, right? And you've really evolved into this woman who's focused on helping people connect to their intuition. And you're clearly way more flexible in your relationship with food and your body and what health looks like. So can you share with me why connecting to your intuition is so important when it comes to doing the healing work?
When I was sharing about my journey and was talking about extremes, I think that is being in the extreme is the antithesis of listening to your intuition. And what I found is when I was working to fully recover, it was definitely my inclination to just want to go to the opposite extreme. And I see this sometimes with my clients too, and I'm sure you do as well, where it feels like, okay, I was so rigid and had no flexibility, but now I want to go to the other side where maybe you don't even end up feeling good because you're just like, you have no structure at all. Like, okay, I'm just going to skip meals, or I'm never going to eat anything that makes me feel good, or I'm not, you know what I'm saying? It's just, it goes from one side to another side. And that was my first inclination. And so when I was really on the journey to finding the way of eating that worked for me, I recognized that it wasn't just going from one thing to another. It was actually getting in touch with myself. And so for me, I speak to that as in your intuition, obviously around food, but also your body and exercise. And the beautiful thing about when you get in touch with that is that it stands the test of time against anything, against diet culture, against someone telling you something that you need to do or need to not do, because you know exactly what works for you and you trust yourself. And that allows for you to genuinely eat what makes you feel best, to move in the way that works for your body, and to sit in the body that feels best, and also to allow that to change moment to moment, day to day, and year to year, because it will as we evolve throughout life.
So you talk about getting in touch with yourself. How might someone start to get in touch with themselves? Because I really like how you kind of shared, a person who's not in touch with themselves might go from one extreme to the next. Like they're like, this is what I should be doing now. I should only be doing like intuitive eating. And whatever I see an intuitive eating is great, but like I could see an extreme version, right? Where maybe you're still not honoring yourself or what you need. So how did you find that middle ground, and how can people get in touch with themselves who are afraid?
So true that it can feel scary, because going back to what we were talking about, I do think some of the things we already addressed, like allowing yourself to feel your emotions or to have a free thought in your day, they are kind of the foundation to even being able to start to listen to yourself. So that sets the stage. And then I also think that along with that, at least when we're specifically talking about the things that we talk about with food, so much of it is also getting rid of all of the voices in your head that are not your own. So diet culture, society, your mom that struggles with her relationship with food, the teacher that told you to do X, Y, Z, and clearing those away, and also being able to pinpoint the fact that they're there and have that awareness. I mean, that's huge. So those two steps I do find are so important. And then a lot of the next following steps, I feel like, come into fine tuning, understanding generally that it's helpful for us to make sure that we have breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and we have snacks, but also allowing for there to be some flow to that by understanding food neutrality and gentle nutrition and some of those elements that make it feel like you're informed without feeling like you're controlled about what food is supposed to look like.
Mm-hmm. I like that. So being informed, but not controlled. So for you, I assume that was educating yourself about things like food neutrality and the different ways to embrace food without it being so rigid. When we think about outside of food and connecting to our intuition, like, how do you connect with yourself there? Like, I think there's stuff we can apply, like with the food stuff. So for instance, you talked about tuning out the noise and the voices of other people. How does that apply in non-food world?
I do think that there are things that apply, like you're saying, when it comes to how we would process through things with food to then how we would look at things within life. And simultaneously, I do find that the journey is so unique for each person. I feel like for me, just to share from that lens, I do think that it was a lot of that work of, yes, letting go of those traumas, working through them is better, and being able to understand how they affected me. But I also think a lot of it is starting to allow yourself to not only hear maybe what you want to do, like listen to your intuition, but also act on it, And I think that's also a scary piece of it, is you can feel like, I'm going to use another food analogy to try to express what I'm saying so that it comes off clearly. Most of the time, you get to a point where it's probably not good for me to continue to restrict this food. And I know I want that food, but it's actually acting on it. And I think the same thing happens when we're trying to express ourselves. And it goes back to what I was saying about me in high school. It's like I didn't feel like I fit in. I didn't feel like I was good enough. So I repressed who I was. And a lot of that was not thinking what I was going to be, if I listened to what I loved, would be accepted. And so I think that is part of what it is I think more of us are in tune with ourselves than we recognize after we work through some of those first steps, but it's more so allowing for that to be expressed and trusting it.
Yes, I love that. I think there's, like, when I think of my connection to my intuition outside of food, there's always that inner voice that's like just kind of squeaking its little, like, trying, like it's afraid to admit something or it's afraid to face something because it's so scary to act on it. Like, I think of relationships I've had to leave, or like moments where I feel shame around something because I know it's not the right thing for me. And I'm like betraying myself by continuing to do the thing. So I think you're right. Like, there's that internal struggle and there's a lot of courage there that needs to take place in order to act on intuition.
Yeah, I totally agree. It is that courage, and even goes back to what you were saying about sometimes when we are choosing something actively, that does make us uncomfortable because it is not our norm at the time. And so that in and of itself is a journey of even being willing to become uncomfortable when our body is yelling at us, no, don't do that because we want you to be in your comfort zone because we want you to be safe.
I've always felt that, and let me know how you feel. I've always felt that when I connect to my intuition and act on it, I'm like rewarded in some way from the universe. Like I can be scared, I can drag my feet, I can resist. And then when I'm finally like, screw it. Oh no. And I have to like, just like swan dive off the cliff of fear, right? You're like, I'm doing it. And then you finally do. And I feel like I'm always like caught in a safe way, you know, when you truly honor what you're aligned to do, aligned with.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I see the same thing in my life. And I even think back to all those times over those years where I did have that voice that started to come in saying, hey, this is probably not good. And there's a lot of signs of what you're doing. And this obsession is not healthy. And I would ignore it and ignore it and ignore it. And then that almost culminates over time. And then I think about the other times where something's come in and I just think to myself, well, this feels hard, or I don't know if I want to do this, but I'm just going to do it. And every time I'm just shocked at how much easier it is, just how much it flows.
I think that, yeah, same. Do you ever feel like confused and disconnected from your intuition? And why do you think those moments come up for you?
Definitely. It's still something that I cultivate constantly. And I notice that there's a few times when it comes up. I think number one is when I'm out of alignment with things that I know are supportive for me. So even when I was sharing earlier that I used to not have any space where I would just have silence, that's still something that I could tend to because I love to learn. I love to listen to things, but it's remembering to do that, or it's remembering to stay committed to practices that help me feel good. And we all have different ones, whether that be journaling or it's stretching or it's being outside, just all that type of stuff. Allowing myself to overwork, that was for a long time what I went into. Mm-hmm. So those types of things I think are the first one. And I bet most of us can imagine or connect to that. But then I think the second one that I've seen is sometimes it's when there's this big life shift that's coming. And it's not even necessarily that I feel so disconnected. It's just that it's almost needing more space and more time. And I'm wanting to do to get through it and like do the right thing and take the right step. And sometimes you have to just be. And that was even something I struggled with in my healing journey. Is I always felt like I had to do something, but sometimes I wasn't just allowing myself to sit and just like chill within the moment of, okay, what is coming to me right now that I need to notice, right? Or I need to understand. And yeah, that's the other time where I feel like I become disconnected because I'm trying too hard to get through something.
Oh, I relate to that so much. Just this go mentality and feeling like I almost notice it with podcasts. Do you ever? I mean, totally guilty. I love podcasting and I know you love podcasting, but it's one of those things where sometimes I will just turn on a podcast and I'm like, Meg, wouldn't it be a good idea if you just showered in silence today?
Yes.
Where like you just sat in the car and like didn't listen to someone else blabbing around and like maybe you could just like be. And I'm glad I have those moments because it's usually a sign that it's time for me to take a break and stop filling my brain with distraction, essentially.
Yes. Yeah, I so relate to that. And it's so funny because I've thought about it before and I love to learn from other people, but just like you're saying, well, why can't I take a moment though to in some way learn from myself? we all have all these thoughts that want to come to us, and we learn things from just sitting. And I feel like that's even going back to when we're a child. I think that's what's so fun is you kind of sit and you do so many things. I remember my parents be like, oh, you would just like hang out, like doing things by yourself all the time. Like we don't do that enough now. I feel like when we're older, we're just like, go, go, go.
I think that's so cool. I always talk about the value of rest, and I talk about the value of sitting by yourself and like just being. But one of the benefits is learning from yourself. That is such a cool like reframe for people who struggle with rest, right? Is like you can take some time and like actually learn from you. Wouldn't that be cool? That sounds pretty productive to me, like come up with original thoughts and aha moments based on, whatever comes to you in that moment. That's great.
Yes, totally.
Well, you know what? This has been so fun, Mallory, and I really love your energy and everything you brought to this interview today. Thank you so much for sharing about your personal experience. I know it's super vulnerable to get on a platform and share all of these things. So thank you so much for that. And for people listening, do you have any way they can reach out to you in case they want to connect with you?
Yeah. So I am Mallory J. Paige on all platforms, basically, but Instagram is my main one. And I always welcome people reaching out, share anything that you have on your mind. I'm always happy to just connect in that way if someone wants to.
Great. Well, I appreciate it, Mallory. I hope you have a wonderful day.
Yes, you too. Thank you for having me.
You're so welcome. So there you have it. Another episode of Full and Thriving in the books. I want to personally thank you for joining me in listening to today's show. And if you found value in this conversation, I would be so grateful if you could please take a moment to subscribe to the show and leave a review. Your support not only helps us reach more people who are striving to live their most full and thriving life, but it also allows us to bring on even more incredible guests with valuable insights that can change your life. Every follow, every review makes a huge difference, and together we can continue to grow this beautiful community. Thanks again for being a part of the journey, and we'll see you next time on Full and Thriving.